Welcome to the From Scratch Body. I'm Liv and I'm back with the Cook Expert. I'm going to make bread in it today because a lot of you have asked me if I can do a video on that, and I think you'll enjoy it because it is so fun and easy. So I'm going to make 2 loaves in here, the Liv standard, if you know my bread making. So I'm going to take my scales here from Magimix that came with this Cook Expert. I'm going to put the metal bowl on there, then put tare, so it goes back to 0. And I'm aiming for about 1 kilo of flour. I'm going to finish off with a bit of wholemeal flour just to mix it up a little bit, it's nice. 1 sachet of fast dry action yeast. Because hopefully you'll be able to see in this camera here, we're going to go to baking. And then to bread, brioche, and run that. When the yeast has been incorporated into the flour a little bit more, we add a tiny bit of salt. We just don't want the salt to kind of kill off the yeast. So we want to separate them to begin with. A bit of olive oil if you want. You don't have to, but I love a bit of oil in my bread. So it stops at 1 minute, and then you can go in and kind of mix a little bit by hand if you want, but I usually don't find that I need that. So I'll run it again, and then add bit by bit about 600 milliliters of water, maybe a tiny bit more. It's just great seeing how it just very quickly becomes a dough and is doing all of the kneading. You don't have to get your hands in there at all at this point. And when it becomes a dough like that, slowly it incorporates all of the stuff on the sides as well. Kind of gets sticky and takes everything with it. So that's 1 minute again, and I need it to go a little bit longer because I need to add a bit more water. So you can just go back and run it from the start. Really recommend doing just a tiny bit of water, bit by bit, because it might look like it needs more than it does. So just give it a tiny bit, see how it works with that tiny bit more. You can see it working, like trying to escape the bowl. Just going straight into the second half of that again. I think that's a perfect amount of water now, so I'm just going to put this on. And really by now it's needed, I could stop it right here, but I'm just going to let it run because it needs it so powerfully, which is just amazing to get the whole rising process started. It's kneaded, it's all mixed. Look at that, already a massive dough, really looking great. And here's the best bit, for me anyway. Just leave it in there. Go to Expert, 1 hour and 30 minutes. Set this to 0 because we don't want it to knead anymore. And then the lowest temperature that you can set, apart from not setting a temperature at all, which is obviously also an option, but 30 degrees. And now it's going to rise in here, which is just delicious. For me, for example, I have a tiny kitchen, so when I'm working in here, it gets really hot, which is nice for the bread dough to rise, but then I open the window because I get way too hot, and then suddenly there's a breeze, too much change in temperature, so it's not great for the bread dough, basically. You can put it in the oven, but I find that it doesn't really rise very well in the oven for me because I think it's just not quite getting enough oxygen. I don't really know what the reason is, but I have tried that and it didn't really work for me. But rising it in here, well, let's check back in 1.5 hours and let's see how it's done. This has now been rising for 1.5 hours, and as you can see, it's pretty much wanting to take over the kitchen at this point. So I think it's time to get it out of the bowl, and you can kind of see that 1 kilo of flour is probably the maximum you want to go, because any more than that, it's not going to have enough space to rise. But for that sort of amount, which makes 2 loaves, 2 small loaves, it's just perfect, perfect, perfect. This dough feels incredible, really light, gooey, and I love that you can get the blade out here and just get everything out. Scrape off everything. And this is the first time really that you have to get your hands dirty at all. Like up until now, The machine has done everything, which is just great. Well, I think it's great. It just saves me a lot of mess. So I've floured this surface a little bit with some flour. Don't need a lot. Divide that into 2. And now it's kneaded it so well that you don't really need to knead it. You just need to shape it into the loaf shape that you want. And I've got these 2 small bread tins, so I'm just gonna get a tiny bit of olive oil into those and then brush them on the inside so that the bread doesn't stick. Tiny bit of flour will help with that too. And then you just shape your dough. See, you don't have to do any hard manual labor. You just shape them. You don't need to knead them any extra. Shape them. You can put a bit of the olive oil on top as well. We'll add to that crispy crust. And then you just leave those to prove. When you prove, I feel like it's a little bit less sensitive in terms of temperatures and stuff like that. So you just need to let it rise for another hour, maybe a little bit more if you have time. So I'll cover them with a couple of linen towels and leave them for an hour or maybe a little bit more. Right, I don't actually know how long I've left these now. I've been making other videos and kind of lost track of time. I think it's maybe roughly an hour or so. It's very nice and warm in this kitchen because I'm making all sorts of different things. So the bread has risen, the dough has risen very quickly in the proving stage. So I'm just going to put these in the oven now. I have preheated the oven to 210 degrees Celsius and I'm going to put them in there for 30 minutes. These are going to be perfect, I can tell. "30 minutes have gone and the bread is done." It honestly could not be more perfect. I'm so pleased with how the Cook Expert does bread. It just kneads it incredibly well, but also, and that plays a big role in how well it rises, but also just the hassle that it takes out of it. You know, the only time you even have to touch the dough is to shape it a little bit to put it into the tins, and that's it. Now you know, if you've watched my bread video with loads of tips on how to make perfect bread, you have to let it rest on a wire cooling rack. Don't put it on a chopping board or anything because it's not going to be able to breathe underneath, and the whole bread has to breathe to not go soggy. So that's it. You put a kilo of flour. If you want the same as me, if you want 2 loaves like this, you put a kilo of flour with about 600 milliliters of water, maybe a tiny bit more, a bit of yeast, a sachet of yeast, 7 grams, a bit of salt, and maybe a bit of olive oil if you want that. You let it knead, you let it do its job, then you rise it in the metal bowl on 30 degrees for an hour and a half. Then you shape it into the tins or however you want to make your bread, and then you let it prove for roughly an hour, maybe a little bit more. 30 minutes in the oven on 210 degrees. That's it. Hope you enjoy.